Thank you so much. This is an opportunity I have been looking forward to for a long time. So what I would like to do is obviously to welcome everybody who has joined the meeting either through Zoom or through Facebook, um, and to say I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments later on. I also have to apologize for my voice. I've had laryngitis, and so I kind of sound like Batman right now. Um, but I'm going to do my best to tell you about how the Endangered Alphabets Project began, what it is that I've been trying to do for the last 10 or 11 years, and in particular to talk about games and the way that we've been using games as a way to reintroduce and revitalize traditional and minority writing systems and languages. So the Endangered Alphabets Project began completely by accident. Um, I One Christmas, I had no money. I was looking for a way to make Christmas presents for my family. And I hit upon the idea of carving wooden signs, piece of wood, get a little carving tool and sort of gouge it out and paint it for my various family members. And it turned out to be a lot of fun and very successful. And that was sort of how I was teaching myself carving. And as I was doing this, and as I was really starting to enjoy it, I thought that I would try carving in other languages and other scripts, other alphabets, and discovered quite by accident a website called omniglot.com, which has the world's writing systems. And as I'm going through this and reading about them time and time again, it would say no longer taught in schools, no longer used for official purposes, only used by priests, only used by women to write secret love letters. So I thought, this is fascinating. I had no idea. I'd heard of endangered languages, but I had never heard of endangered alphabets. And in fact, I'm the person who ended up coining the phrase endangered alphabets. And so I created an exhibition of carvings in some of these minority and indigenous scripts. And people said two things to me that I wasn't expecting. One, they said, this is art. And I had really just thought of myself as copying, not really creating art. And the other thing they said was, this is really important. You have to keep on doing this. And that was when I realized that at the age of 56, I had discovered my life's work. So for the next couple of years, I did research. I did carvings in a number of different minority alphabets. And then something really important happened, which is that I met somebody who was from a minority culture that was being significantly suppressed by the government of its country. And I found out what it was like to live on that side of the fence. Obviously, I'm white, I'm late middle age, I'm Anglo-Saxon. I grew up with all of the privileges of being able to assume that the world would come to me rather than vice versa. When I started seeing what it was like for him and what it was like um, for him to go to school, for example, on his first day of school and be beaten for not paying attention because the lesson was in a language that he didn't speak, and to have to learn a different writing system in order to be able to just get by as a 6-year-old. And then also other things that went along with it, like what it was like to have the military come in and set fire to your village as you fled into the jungle. And that was when the Endangered Alphabets Project really changed. And instead of being an academic enterprise or an artistic enterprise in which I was just kind of showing stuff, it was clear that I needed to become much more involved. So that was when I started creating educational materials in particular for the schools. So this was in the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. And there are many indigenous cultures there. There are 12 or 13, in fact. But they are essentially denied full status and citizenship. And in particular, they're denied the right to be educated in their own language and their own alphabet. So I started working with this friend of mine and some teachers at a school that he had created, which was a mother tongue school. And of course, they had no teaching materials whatsoever. And so I worked with him to create alphabet charts and storybooks and coloring books and all sorts of things which enabled the kids to be members of their own community while they were learning, as opposed to having to try to be members of some other community, some community that was more official or had more status and spoke a different language. So this was a very, very important phase in my learning. And for about 4 or 5 years, I collaborated with them and then began collaborating with other people from other cultures elsewhere in the world as well. So the point that I'm getting to is something that happened around 4 years ago when I sort of went, if you want to revive a language, whether it's a spoken language or a written language, you really have to get to the kids. And if you want to get to the kids, you've got to use games. And so I started thinking about games that would involve, that could be played by children or could be played by community members. They could, for example, that children could take the game home and play it with their parents or their grandparents. Games that were cheap, that didn't rely on electricity, that were familiar in that, for example, they might use a pack of cards. I experimented with games using dominoes. I experimented with games sort of loosely based on Scrabble. And this is part of a long, interesting conversation about how different languages actually have very different requirements in terms of what games work with them. And during the Q&A, we can talk about that if you're interested. Out of all of this came some card games and some decks of cards in non-Latin alphabets. We actually had, I think, 8 different decks in different alphabets from the Philippines and from the Middle East and from Africa. And we had games that you could play with these decks of cards with the letters from their alphabet. So out of that grew a bigger project, which I'm going to hold up and show to you right now. I got contacted by someone from Bulgaria who said he was really interested in reviving the ancient Glagolitic script. This is a script that was devised to write Old Slavonic by missionaries. And so I created a board game that was set in a monastery in 1200 AD. And I'm going to hold this up for you here. So it's a game, it's a murder mystery. And the players move around the board in this monastery. And they have to learn the Glagolitic alphabet in order to figure out 2 things, something about a murder and something about a treasure. And then they have to escape with the treasure, which turns out to be a book, a very significant book. So Glagolitic Abbey was a year in the making, was a lot of fun to develop. And that's where the game situation stood until August, September of 2020. So, excuse me, I'm sucking a lozenge because of my sore throat here. If I do strange things with my face, it's just because I'm sucking a lozenge. Also, drinking tea. So, in the late summer of 2020, as many of you, of course, know, the Chinese government announced that in the province of Inner or Southern Mongolia, some of the lessons which had been traditionally taught in Mongolian and using the wonderful vertical Mongol Bichig script would now be taught in Chinese. And given what else was happening in China, it was pretty clear that this would turn out to be an effort to undermine the Mongol tradition and language and culture and identity within the borders of China. At roughly the same time, what we also heard was that in Mongolia, the country, the government had decided to reintroduce the traditional vertical Bichig script over a period of time, because, of course, the Cyrillic script is, it's a reminder of the influence of the Soviet Union in the 20th century over the Mongol people. And reintroducing a traditional script is extremely difficult because it's so unfamiliar. It hasn't been used in Mongolia on a day-to-day basis by the mass of people since the Second World War. So there are really two challenges then. There's the challenge facing the Mongols in Southern or Inner Mongolia. There's the challenge facing the Mongol people in Mongolia who are scheduled to relearn their own traditional script. And there's a challenge in the West. And the challenge in the West is that the Mongols have suffered from terrible publicity and propaganda ever since 800 years ago. And when you see any representation of the Mongol people, it tends to be extremely insulting. They tend to represent forces that are aggressive and sort of savage. And I thought this is also an opportunity to do something about the way in which the rest of the world sees the Mongol people. So I started collecting together a team and thinking about what kind of game can we create which introduces the some aspects of Mongolian language and script and culture and history and mythology. How can we be respectful and do justice to these extraordinarily rich elements of Mongol culture, and at the same time create a game that is fun and interesting and exciting? And so I'll tell you about the game we've come up with. I'll tell you some of the details about its contents and its purpose. And I would really like to know if we've done anything wrong or badly. My aim is to be respectful and to bring just a little bit of this extraordinarily rich culture to the people who play the game. But I am an outsider. I don't speak Mongolian. I've never been to Mongolia, although I was actually planning to go there in 2020 if COVID hadn't hit. and actually do a documentary about Mongolian calligraphy, which I find absolutely stunningly beautiful. So the possibility of my making mistakes is pretty high. We've drafted, we've had some wonderful volunteers from Mongolian communities actually around the world. We have two of the artists for the game, Mongolian, have done this extraordinary artwork for the cards. We have a great Mongolian calligrapher, Tamir, who is going to be hand lettering some stuff for the game. And the game is being handmade in Mongolia. So I'm hoping that this really brings together a game which is both fascinating and playable, and really, as I say, is rich with the culture of the Mongol people. So let me tell you how the game goes. All right. So apparently, according to the great god Wikipedia, when the Mongol Empire had reached its greatest extent and really was this contiguous empire from Korea all the way to Eastern Europe, a debate broke out among the descendants of Genghis Khan, because they had now seen a huge amount of the world. And the question became, who do we want to be? Now that this territory is Mongol territory, who are the Mongols? Are we a traditional pastoral nomadic people? Are we, or do we want to be, a European style people, city-based? And it struck me that this is just an extraordinarily interesting question, and one that many people in the world must be asking themselves right now. Who are we? Are we the people we were? Are we the people we want to be? And so I imagined a situation kind of like in Greek mythology. So in Greek mythology, you have all of these gods, many of whom are related to each other. And they're always quarreling. They're always fighting amongst themselves. But instead of fighting themselves, they play out their drama on the human chessboard. And so they have favorites and champions down here on the world, and they get involved in the quarrels and the struggles among gods. And in fact, the gods then sort of manipulate them. It's a really interesting and complicated situation. So I thought, supposing we have half a dozen gods from the Mongol tradition, and obviously there are many more gods than that, and there are many traditions, but we chose some familiar names. So Tengri is there, of course. And I imported and Burkut and Olgun and Mergen and Etugan Eke, and I also imported a minor character, Lobsagoi, who as like a trickster demon or trickster god, who doesn't play the game fairly at all. Anyhow, so each of these gods has a different version of what they want the Mongol lands to be like, and what they want Mongol culture to be. So, for example, one god wants this magnificent wide open expanse of land to remain a magnificent wide open expanse of land as a wildlife sanctuary. Another god wants it to be a culture of trade and manufacture and progress and exchange with the outside world. Another wants it to be a home of social justice where no child is harmed or grows up hungry. So all of these gods have different ambitions. And each of them is looking for their own particular ulus, their own particular version of the Mongol nation. And so the game, therefore, is called Ulus, Legends of the Nomads. So the way the gods try to establish their own particular ulus, their own particular form of Mongol culture in the Mongol lands, is by having a champion on Earth. And these champions, some of them are real people, some of them mythological figures. And again, we had a great time researching Mongolian history and culture for these champions. So one of them, of course, is Genghis Khan. One of them is Hutulun, the wrestler, the champion woman wrestler who retired undefeated after out wrestling all of her suitors. One of them is Zanabazar, the scholar and artist and writer and mystic. So each of them has their own character. And what each of the champions has to do is to collect the kinds of asset that would be necessary to establish their particular version of the Mongol future. So, so one who is looking to create an empire of spirituality and religion and sort of deep thought. As they are traveling around, and I'll tell you about the travel in a second, they're trying to collect cards that represent those qualities. And so one of the cards is, for example, a deer stone. One of them is pen and ink. One of them is paper. Each of these is an asset that is valuable to a particular god for their particular vision of how the lands will go. So at the beginning of the game, all of the champions gather. And the game itself is nomadic. So each turn takes place in a different season at a different site. And there are 8 sites on the board, and each one is associated with a different season. And so all of the champions move around season by season from one site to another. And all of these sites are familiar and rich places, again, from the Mongol landscape or from Mongol mythology. So one of them is Ureg Lake, which I feel particularly close to because Ureg Lake supposedly has a lake monster. And I live here on Lake Champlain, which also supposedly has a lake monster, although I have not seen it. Another site would be the Magao Caves, for example, and another would be the Whistling Sand Dunes of Dalad Bana. As the champions travel from one of these sites to another, at each site they encounter a monster or monsters, and they have to decide, am I going to try and defeat this monster? In which case, if I defeat the monster, I take an asset card. Yes, this is our game mat. Great, thanks for pulling this up. So what you'll see then is that there are 8 circles around the outside, each of which corresponds to a season. And so at the beginning of the game, the sacred sites cards are shuffled and dealt out to each of those locations. And the season is important because in the winter, the monsters are hungrier and more powerful. People, all of the champions travel together around site by site, and each of them in turn has to decide, am I going to do battle with the resident monster and try and win an asset card? Or am I badly injured, for example, and I'm going to sit out and heal this time around? And part of the competition or the struggle conflict with the monsters involves something which a lot of games, traditional street games involve, but as far as I'm aware, this is the first board game to involve them, namely Shigai. So the Shigai take, which, as you know, are here we go. These are the Shigai. Great job with the production going on here, by the way. Thank you. So the Shigai really have two different purposes. So Shigai are used for divination. They're a little bit like the bones that you roll in the I Ching. And so when a champion decides to take on a monster, the first thing they do is to roll their 4 Shigai to find out whether luck is on their side or whether their god is on their side and whether they're likely to actually defeat this monster. So the Shigai play this kind of divination role, which is significantly more than just a dice roll throughout the game, until we get to the second half of the game, which we're going to come on to in a second. So the champions, they travel from place to place. They do battle with the monsters. They gain asset cards. They trade asset cards. If they are losing to a monster, they can try and get another champion to help them defeat it, but then they have to give that champion something in return. So this journey is really taking them throughout the entire realm of the traditional Mongol lands. So we're not just talking about Mongolia, we're not just talking about Inner Mongolia, we're talking about that entire kind of mythic realm. Once they have visited all 8 sites, then they proceed to Naadam. So Naadam, as of course, many of you know, is the traditional summer festival. So we've been going season by season around the board. It's now summer. We've arrived at Naadam. And at Naadam, we have the contests of the 3 traditional Mongol sports, horse racing, archery, and wrestling. And each of those is a Shigai game, which is based on some of the children's Shigai games played throughout Asia. And which are played on the game mat. These are games that involve physical dexterity and skill, rolling them, shooting them, pinging them. So it's really kind of interesting that somebody who is just a really great board game player or card game player can be really in the lead at this point. But if they don't also have that physical dexterity and skill, they may then fall behind. So there's horse racing, where everybody gallops all around the game mat through all of the places they visited in the first part of the game. There's wrestling, which is a Shigai shooting game, and then there's archery. And so the center of the mat is kind of like an archery bullseye. And so you're trying to flick your Shigai so it rolls and stops right in the center. And then there's one final thing, which is that I'm really interested in the role that traditional storytelling and Tulsh, the storyteller, played in traditional Mongol culture. The telling of a story, an epic story, like the Epic of Jengar, for example, was not just a way of entertaining people, it was a way of bringing good fortune and focus and kind of spiritual richness to that gathering. And storytelling was used to produce better crops, for example, or milder winter, or to heal the sick. And so the last thing that happens at Naadam is a storytelling enterprise. So by the end of the game, everybody has collected some asset cards, they have some strength points, and the idea being that if you're going to create an empire, you need the assets, you need the right tools, the right circumstances, the right objects, but you also need strength to be able to build it and sustain it. And so there's a combination of strength points and asset cards. And then this very last thing at the games at Nardum, the winner of one of the games gets an Eternal Blue Sky card, because I just love the way in which that extraordinary open Mongolian landscape and the vastness of the sky has that kind of spiritual quality, which sort of it's as if you're opened up to heaven by being so unenclosed. So we definitely built the Eternal Blue Sky element into there as well. So our aim, our hope is threefold, really. We hope that the initial release of the game, which was funded by a Kickstarter in people mostly in the West are expecting now a copy of the game. We're hoping the game is going to be ready by the end of June. And so this then becomes a way to introduce Westerners who typically know very, very little about Mongol culture, as I didn't, to this wonderfully rich, interesting landscape. And also to elements of the Mongolian language and script. It's the purpose of the game is not to teach the Mongolian language. It's to just open the door a little so people can be curious and they can see the script and they can see what a fascinating, iconic visual image it is. Then we're also hoping that the game will be played in Mongolia, and we are actually commissioning translations of the rules right now, so that people in Mongolia can play the game, can relish their own cultural history and background, and maybe it will have some value in the process of reintroducing the traditional Mongol Bichig script in Mongolia. As to what happens in China, in the province of Inner Mongolia, we can't say. There's no telling how that is going to go. But a friend of mine who is Polish and therefore spent some of his life under communism said the best thing that we can do is to give people the means to remember and value their own culture, even while they are being disrespected, suppressed, even while their own culture is, in some sense, under someone else's thumb, because that, in the end, will end. And as he saw in Poland, there is an emergence, and if you haven't lost and forgotten your culture, then it all comes back. So that's our aim. We are hoping that we'll actually be able to set up a relationship with some kind of agency or company in Mongolia who will take over the business of manufacturing and selling the game in Mongolia. We are working with a number of people in Mongolia who are doing the design of the game mat and bag. And by the way, this was a lucky guess on my part. I had this idea that wouldn't it be perfect for a nomadic culture if you have a game that, instead of coming with a stiff board and a box and all this kind of stuff, is actually something that is on a piece of cloth, and then it has a drawstring. You can just put all the game cards and pieces on it and just draw it up and sling it over the pommel of saddle of your horse. Well, it turns out that that actually is a Mongol tradition. And so we're using that tradition. So the game is not going to arrive in a box, it's going to arrive in a drawstring bag, which then becomes the mat. The one last thing that I want to leave you with actually is not to do with the game. It's to do with one of my carvings. So the very first thing that I did when we started this enterprise was I was looking at a hand-painted calligraphy banner that a teenage boy in Inner Mongolia had done in Bichik calligraphy. And what he had written was kind of a protest slogan. And it was, it says, a foreign language is a tool, right? It's a useful thing to know a foreign language, but a mother tongue, our own language, is our soul. And so I carved that saying right there. And this is a carving that I'm going to be presenting to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. As a way of emphasizing both our commitment to the Mongol language, Mongol people, Mongol script, and also to reaffirm that this is why endangered alphabets matter, because an alphabet is not simply a way of indicating how to say certain letters. It's not just a way of recording a speech so the speech doesn't get lost. For the Mongol people in particular, the fact that this extraordinarily beautiful script has been intimately associated with your culture for 800 years or more means that the very visual symbols are part of your landscape in the same way that a flag is part of a landscape or music is part of the landscape. The fact that it's a script that in particular is shaped by the brush, by the movement of the human hand. And so you can actually see the movement of the letter and the movement of the writer, humanizes it and makes it extraordinarily personal. So I'm going to continue doing carvings in Mongol calligraphy and promoting the work of Mongol calligraphers. And I'm hoping that our game is part of this overall effort to bring a renewed sense of dignity and self-respect to the Mongol people, wherever they may be. Thank you. I happily take questions now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brooks. That was a great presentation, and really excited to learn more about the Olus game. We can start taking questions. If you'd like to ask a question, just do the raise hand. I don't know if there's a raise your hand button, so you can do that. We used to just let people leave their questions in a written comment, but we're gonna allow people to ask their open their mics and ask questions. One of the things that you said that really piqued my interest was how the ankle bone or similar bones are used throughout Asia in games, right? Yeah. So I'm asking this because last year a video game studio debuted a video game called Fragile on Steam platform, and I was watching this video game tester or reviewer on YouTube, the way she's playing the game, and she had the hardest time understanding the ankle bone game, the system. So and I don't blame her, because it's really foreign to Western game systems, and it's not just it's easy to understand the game. I mean, a single bone as a dice, but when there's actual games, they're really strange. So my question is, how were the reactions of people in the US or in the stateside who got to play with your prototype, or who are your testers?
Right. Yep. So there were at least 3 different interesting reactions. One was that we have 2 versions of the game, two levels. We have the basic game, we have a deluxe version. And the basic game, we're using plastic shigai, because obviously they're much cheaper and lighter. And I thought that people would be kind of really turned off by the idea that they were actually playing with real bones. It'd be like, oh, And what I discovered was that there certainly is a small percentage of people who kind of go, does that still have blood on it? Or, things like that. But a remarkable number of people were so fascinated that they said, we want to pay extra to have the authentic bone shigai. So that really suggests that it touches something very deep, Secondly, the fact is, we did a bunch of testing, just rolling handfuls of shigai over and over again. And what we discovered was that not only are the shigai irregular in shape, but and also that one shigai will vary from another. They're not consistent in terms of roles. So some faces are going to turn up more often than others. And so we actually had to redesign the game based on the fact that a shigai does not behave like a die. So people who are diehard dice game fans rely on the fact that there is an equal distribution of outcomes when you roll the dice. We realized we had to do something different. Third thing is that in some respects, shigai games are actually kind of like games of jacks or games of marbles. And so to draw an analogy between this is how you're going to use the shigai in this particular part of the game with jacks or marbles made it easier to understand. But for me, the shigai is like at the heart of everything, because it is irregular, it is unpredictable, right? And as such, it brings in an element that you could call luck, or if you're somebody who is really interested in these phenomena and you're interested in the tarot, for example, then you kind of go, that isn't luck, that is divine guidance. And so the idea that when you roll the shigai, you are asking for your particular God to be on your side at this moment, that's different from taking a dice and shaking and kind of blowing on it and say, okay, be lucky for me, etc. You're more aware of the kind of the role of fate in your life by playing with the shigai.
Thank you. So if there's any other question, please feel free to raise your hand and ask. We have a comment on our Facebook Live, under our Facebook Live, from Julie Pitson. She says, as a former teacher in Mongolia, this seems like it would be a wonderful tool for teaching Mongolian history and culture. Happy to hear you're using Mongolian artists and hope you get to visit Mongolia soon. Best of luck.
Thank you so much. Yes, we're gonna need all the luck we can get. Yes,
Wonderful.
dealing with customs and importing, several thousand Shagai, is luckily I'm not doing that. There's somebody who is a much more organized person than I on my team who's in charge of that, and she's also having to deal with like the time difference and the language issue, etc. So this is a shout out to Meg Pollitt, who is handling our international relations brilliantly.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this is really a great project, and as throughout the history of Mongolia, we've had several alphabets, not just the classical Mongolian alphabet, but several other alphabets. I was wondering if you're also interested in doing more artwork or educational materials on those alphabets. We have the Clear script or the Totobuchik, which is like and most of them are practically extinct. They're not really used anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So if this game is successful, then I can totally imagine expansion packs. So, for example, we could have an entire Tibetan expansion pack, because that's a huge part of the culture that we've barely drawn on at all. We could have other monsters. There's plenty more monsters we haven't brought in yet, and I love the idea of having other language or script expansion packs as well. Oh, and by the way, we have two more ideas for games connected with Mongolian language and script. So one of my extended team, who's in Germany, is trying to create a card game that will teach the script. And he's working very hard at that. But there's a much simpler game, a kid's game, that I'm hoping that I'm going to work on actually with my older daughter. Both my daughters are artists. So in England, in the middle of the 19th century, there was a card game created called Happy Families. So Happy Families, essentially you have a deck of cards, and within that deck, there are a number of professions, like a baker, for example. And so with each of these professions, there would be a Mr. Baker, a Mrs. Baker, and then their two children, a boy and a girl, right? And so the cards are shuffled and dealt out, and you basically try to collect families. So you say to the person next to you, do you have Mr. Plumber? And if they do, they give you the card, etc. So it's a very, very simple, very familiar children's game that children can play with their parents or with each other. So I have the idea of doing a Happy Mongolian Dinosaur Families game, because most of the most famous dinosaurs in the world were found in Mongolia, right? This is, again, part of the Mongol heritage. And so I like the idea of having like adult male velociraptor, adult female velociraptor, juvenile velociraptor, hatchling velociraptor. And then what we would do is we'd have their names in Bichig script as well as in Latin. And it would be a very simple game, but the artwork would just be so much fun. And again, the kids are seeing this different script and they're kind of going, wait a second, I thought these dinosaurs came from Jurassic Park. You kind of go, no, Jurassic Park is fiction.
Yeah, that's a great idea too. Like there are a lot of dinosaur species that have been unearthed from Mongolia and Inner Mongolia as well. Yeah. So if people want to learn more about the project and the game, I assume I understand the Kickstarter project is still active. Where can
No,
they
the
contact you? Where
Kickstarter is
can they?
complete.
Mhm.
The Kickstarter is complete. Yeah. The best way to there's two ways. People can go to endangeredalphabets.com to learn about the endangered alphabets in general. But actually, if they go to Kickstarter and just type in endangered alphabets, then that will take them to our recently completed Kickstarter, which just tells them a lot about the game. And the absolute best thing people can do is actually subscribe to our mailing list. So if you go to endangeredalphabets.com and subscribe, then you get put on the mailing list, and I can let people know, how things are coming, when it's going to get released, where it can be ordered, all that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you very much. We have also some very kind words in the comment section coming from Lauren and Devina. And if there aren't any other questions, we'll wrap up this session. And I'll also leave the last question open to you if you have any other comments you'd like to leave before we finish.
I cannot wait for the day when the world settles down and I can come to Mongolia and actually see not only traditional Mongol sports in action, but also see the work of traditional Mongolian calligraphers in action. That is something I've been looking forward to now for 18 months, and that would make me happier than just about anything else right now.
Sounds good. Okay. We also hope that this ends, this nightmare of these days end really soon. So with that, we would like to thank Mr. Brooks and also our audience. We have our next session in Mongolian language. So we're alternating between English and Mongolian hosted sessions, but this has been very interesting and very good for the society. Very timely session about a very timely project. So we wish you all the best. And with that, we'll end the session. So thank you, everyone.